Good afternoon, everyone. Carahsoft would like to welcome you to our Telos webinar. Carahsoft Technology is a trusted government IT solutions provider, delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local agencies. Carahsoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all its vendors, including. We are offering 1 CPE credit to those who attend today's webinar. In order to qualify for the credit, you must be actively listening, as well as answering any polling questions that will be presented. If you meet all of the requirements, you will receive a certificate. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Martin Rieger, Chief Solutions Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at Stack Armor. Stephen Horvath, Senior Vice President, Exacta Solutions at Telos Corporation. And Melissa Lejeskic, CEO of Kyberstorm. Melissa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Paige. Just share my screen real quick. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on FedRAMP Rev 5. My name is Milica Lijeskic, and I'm CEO of Kyberstorm. We're a small cybersecurity firm specialized in cybersecurity and compliance, mainly FedRAMP advisory services. So that's where really our expertise lie. And so anything that you need from understanding the requirements if you're just starting off, completing a gap assessment, or designing a compliance system architecture, documenting everything, we're right there for you. So we'll have Steve Horvath introduce himself next.
Thanks, Melissa. Steve Horvath, I've been at Telos for 18 years, roughly. Most folks that are in the FedRAMP ecosystem are kind of familiar with Telos, but we sell a product called Exacta. And Exacta is a platform for walking through the more rigorous risk and compliance frameworks, much like NIST 853 and 837, right? Also for cybersecurity framework, and we do a lot with ISO standards. And I think one of the fun and more important things that we wanted to also bring to everybody's attention today is not just the Rev 5 transition, but each of us as panelists have all been working together for quite some time. And each one of us brings a different kind of area of effect to the fight as far as helping customers get through the process. So from my perspective, we build and sell the Exacta platform and solution, right? So it's all about trying to help automate, get through as much of this process as quickly and cheaply as possible. Melissa, on the other hand, has a tremendous amount of background. She's got the background in 3PAO, actually going through this process, and she does a lot of advisory and consulting, getting folks through, some of the more difficult hurdles. And then I'll turn it over to Martin and let Martin talk a little about him and Stack Armor.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon. My name is Martin Rieger. I'm our Chief Solutions Officer here at Stack Armor. We have a very deep level of experience in delivering secure and compliant solutions for regulated industries, especially in the government, financial, healthcare, and energy sector. We specialize in FedRAMP, FISMA, RMF, and DoD ATO acceleration. We're heavily partnered with Telos, and we leverage the Exacta solution for all the OSCAL and GRC type components. Additionally, we have a stack that we deploy for customers in Boundary to help them get them there just a little bit faster. So looking forward to the discussion today and the conversation around the future of FedRAMP.
Same here.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so today we'll be discussing the major shift that happened with Rev 5 and how that's impacted FedRAMP authorization, reauthorization, and the whole FedRAMP ecosystem. We'll talk about some of the challenges that we see our customers face, and then also, lessons learned that we have. And then we'll talk about OSCAL as well and its potential to really streamline and automate this process. So please feel free to add any questions during this presentation. We'd like to keep it conversational, and if you have any pain points, please share with us. We'll be happy to answer. Okay, so to start off, I'd like to talk about the timeline. So there's been a lot of confusion as to whether you need to be on Rev 4 or Rev 5, where you at in the process. So let's just clear that up from the beginning. So the way FedRAMP looks at CSPs and Rev 5, it really puts it into 3 different buckets. So CSPs that are in a planning phase, which means you don't have, FedRAMP authorization, you are maybe just looking at it right now, you don't have an agency, you haven't engaged the agencies prior to May of this year. So you definitely need to be on a Rev 5, right? That's how they see it. However, I would like to introduce one thing to think about here. If you are going for a FedRAMP ATO and you're going to do simultaneously a DISA PATO, then maybe you want to think about staying on Rev 4 and then get that exception from FedRAMP that always open to if something like that is needed, right? So you don't want to be on Rev 4 and Rev 5 at the same time because DISA doesn't accept Rev 4 yet. I'm sorry, Rev 5 yet. So then we have CSPs that are in initiation phase, which means you have started the process. You probably have a 3PAO. You maybe even completed your RAR. So you should stay on Rev 4. You'll be accepted with just completing your package, using the old templates, using the SAR and SAP from the Rev 4. But again, if you think that it might more benefit you as a company to be on Rev 5 because your customers might want you to be on Rev 5, that's something that you need to think about, right? That's going to be your decision to make. But if you continue to be on Rev 4, then you will have to submit with your package, you will have to submit your transition plan to include how you're planning to implement these controls, including your SSP and your SAR, and then and your plan. And then the next time around, when it comes to the annual assessment, that's when you're going to be due to be on Rev 5. When it comes to the CSPs in continuous monitoring phase, that's those who already have FedRAMP authorization. And by October 2nd, which is in the past, right, you should already have a transition plan in place. You should already have everything documented in the SSP and the POEM and communicated that to your authorizing official. And so if that's the case, then you are due for a Rev 5 implementation by your next assessment. And just to make sure that if your next assessment is due by the end of this year, you still have 1 full year to transition to Rev 5. So from your next set, or you already had it, then you have 1 full year from that moment that annual assessment was due. Anybody wants to add something? Martin, Steve?
I think you brought up a good point. I would just add, I think you brought up a good point. I think sometimes people have this perception of the FedRAMP PMO, if you haven't been heavily engaged with them as much as, the 3 of us have been. So people have the perception of them as they're like a really difficult college professor, right? That's going to grade your paper really, really hard. And what Melissa said is really important, right? They're actually more of a negotiation. They have a vested interest in wanting your service to be available, right, to the government. That's the whole point of the FedRAMP PMO, and they're kind of measured by how many they get through the process. So the more that they can streamline and work with you and understand what your service is and kind of how you're meeting those controls, and if you have a good justification, as she said, to negotiate, hey, I understand you guys are really pushing to go to Rev 5. However, we are also going on in the DISA clouds, and it's going to be a function of them not being quite prepared for Rev 5 in this instance, depending on the baseline. Also, they're going to listen. And you're going to be able to have that conversation, and most likely things can go your way. As long as you're presenting a reasonable case. So that's the only thing I would add. Just sometimes we get caught up in this is expensive and really scary, and it's like they're actually not the bad guys that people kind of pretend they are. It's just they have a very specific responsibility, and they take it very seriously.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Steve, and I think this is where you're kind of heading is it is a partnership, right? And that partnership includes the agencies and the 3PAOs as well, not just the PMO. And while it can be sort of a love-hate relationship, I think it's definitely a partnership, right? And so to your point, the goal is to get as many folks through the process as we can and provide those services that the government so desperately needs, and not to hinder the process, but to help enable. And today was another FedRAMP office hours, in which case question and answers. This is something new that they've done with the Rev 4 to Rev 5 transition that we didn't see during the Rev 3 to Rev 4. That would have been awesome. But I think as much as we're figuring it out, they're also kind of figuring it out too, which is why those office hours are so critical.
Okay, so moving on. So what has changed, right, since Rev 4? And a lot has changed. So one point to make, not only do we have one new control, a full new control family brought in, supply chain, we also have one control family that's been revamped and brought into security controls. So we have PT controls brought into as part of security controls. And then we have some new controls that have been added. And not even that, we have some controls that used to be enhancements, but now promoted into actual controls. So a lot to pay attention to, really. If you take a look, just like a high level, there's like 52 new controls and control enhancements. Again, that's kind of questionable because some of the controls, and you'll see that the 16 controls were withdrawn. But when you actually take a deeper look in it, they're really not like taken away. They're more like incorporated into another control, or they're moved to a new control family, like supply chain family. Then we have a lot of control text changes, right? So not only there's some like minor control changes, such as like control title has been changed, but there's also more significant changes when it comes to actually the meaning of that control. More guidance has been added. I feel like it's been a little bit more clear, a little bit more definite, and like it's not you're going to remove or disable account, you're going to disable the account. So it's more like, okay, here's a prescription as to how to implement this control. So paying attention to all of these, and we'll go a little bit deeper into parameters and guidance and all that during this presentation. But I just want to point out at a high level all the different changes. The new guidance has been added. You can now see that government is really pushing that new requirements for zero trust have been added. So you see that that's been trickled through the SSP and the new guidance requirements. You also going to see some of the conflicting parameters. You're going to see that maybe it's calling on a NIST implementation, for example, let's say the specific control, IA51, but at the same time, you have a STIG parameter that is going to be more stringent. And when it comes to that, I always advise to be following the more stringent requirements, then you definitely are going to meet that control. Anyone else would like a point? Because we're going to go deeper into these controls.
Yeah, the one thing I would add just is that note there is really important, right? So not just that some of these controls get added and modified and changed, but what even looked like a traditional control in Rev 4 is actually scoped and applied differently, right, in Rev 5. And so it really does take everybody that's been working with it. If you've already gone through this, if you are, getting ready to move in continuous monitoring from Rev 4 to Rev 5, and you've got to do a transition strategy, you really have to get really familiar with the intent of the control, how that control is scoped and applied for your system. I mean, these are important things. So that's all I would add.
Okay. Moving on. Martin?
Yeah, so as far as this overview goes, this is a huge undertaking given all of the changes that have been in place. The updates to things like security awareness and training, the fact that when you are making that transition, it really does require a full gap analysis against the new control baseline. So as Milica just mentioned a moment ago, a couple key dates have already passed, and the most recent one was the October 2nd update to the expectation the month prior, which is identifying the gaps, right? The gaps in implementation, the new plans that need to be added, for example, supply chain risk management plan, and then incorporating those into the new SSP template, right? Understanding the new control structures and the way the SSP template is designed, so your system security plan, in addition to having to go back, reevaluate your policies, your procedures, and your other plans, such as incident response, contingency, configuration management, and then implement those new controls while documenting them along the way. Along with that is the stakeholder aspect, being the agencies, the PMO and or JAB, for those of you that are JAB packages, and incorporating all of these lessons learned and feedback to the PMO as well, which is something I would say since May 30th has been one of the biggest items, is that feedback to the PMO about things that have been incorporated into the baselines that in many cases there are instances where CSPs are not going to be able to do some of the things they're asking for. For example, IE 212, and looking at identifying somebody in person through two forms of identification, verifying who they are, retaining that information such as driver's license and or another form like a government issued ID or your passport, for example, which for some folks would trigger the privacy family. So these things are being worked out. The lessons learned in the last 5 months are already being incorporated. So I think that's one of the best things that's happening right now, is the ability to communicate that back to the government, to the agencies, the PMO and the JAB, and say, hey, there are some things that were put in here that maybe we need to go back and rethink. So those updates and revisions are pretty critical. If you want to move to the next one, we can talk a little bit more about those new documents that we kind of just mentioned, right? So, with the release, it was announced that, hey, along the way throughout Q3 and Q4 of this year, 2023, we will be releasing updated documentation. Additionally, they're going to be providing training early next year. But the most important things I think that stand out to me are the FedRAMP OSCAL baseline profiles. And Steve, I know you're going to dig into that, so I won't. But even today during the office hours, this was a big topic of conversation. The other items are, we've got a brand new security assessment plan template. The security assessment report itself has been designed. Those are OSCAL enabled now, along with expectations and changes to the way the plans of action and milestones are being addressed. And this is across each baseline, LI, SAS, low, moderate, and high. We're still waiting on DoD, as Melitza kind of mentioned, expected early next year. But for those that are, those IL4s that have the moderate packages and or highs that are being leveraged in that capacity, kind of in a holding pattern there. But as far as these go, these are up on the GSA website. They're available for download right now for those of you that may not have been aware or haven't checked them out. I encourage you to go review those.
I would also add, just real quick, Martin, like part of the streamlining and automation that we offer as part of the Xacta solution is actually the generation of these automatically right in the product. So for those of you that don't have experience with Xacta, we kind of cut our teeth doing, back when it used to be called certification and accreditation, doing firm fixed price certification and accreditations for different military customers. And we've been a part of the entire process, moving not just from DITSCAP, DICAP, NIST, or DCIT 6.3 to NIST, but also bringing everybody from Rev 2 to Rev 3 to Rev 4 to Rev 5 transitions. And we have an updated template that'll be released, I think, in the next 30 days or so. It's got the most recent documents that are approved by the FedRAMP PMO, and also enabling OSCAL, right? So providing that back to the government for a speedier authorization via OSCAL. So I just wanted to add that as a piece. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve, for adding that. And one quick note on the kind of the POEM guidelines and those expectations. Any CSP who completed their last annual assessment between January 2nd of this year and July 3rd have up to 1 year from the date of that assessment to complete the implementation and the migration to these new documentation. So that transition period, if you fall in that category, you're already underway, right? So this includes testing, right? So for everybody else that is July 3rd through December 15th of this year, well, same situation. They have no later than 1 year in 2024 from that date to complete their implementation and their testing. So regardless of which sort of 6-month period you kind of fall into, it's important to note that the clock has really already started. So with that, let's take a look at some of the controls. So, we showed a slide a few minutes ago that kind of gave you a breakdown, and this is just a little bit of a visualization to say, okay, there were 47 controls removed from the moderate baseline, and it's important to remember that many of these weren't necessarily deprecated, but rolled up. So those enhancements that Melissa was mentioning, some of those became controls, or they were basically absorbed into their original parental controls. So that being said, you see 47 controls taken away and you're like, yay. Okay, well, not necessarily. When you look at the next slide where we show, okay, here's the controls that have been added back. Well, you got 45 controls brought back into the baseline. With some of these being new, but again, those parameter changes, like a good example of a major parameter change is CM6 and the move from CIS level 1, level 2 benchmarks to DISA STIGs being the priority. Those types of things are things that really need to be paid attention to, especially when you're going back and reevaluating your configurations and understanding what all this means for your environment. So again, the management, operational, and technical aspects of these controls, it is very important that you understand them all, that you know what the implementation means, and that for the new ones, they're documented. To the far right, you got the SR family or supply chain risk. You've got SBOMs also in scope. And one that's sort of near and dear to us is the requirements around threat modeling, right? So there's lots of new parts and pieces to this that many folks have never done before or aren't familiar with. So that's one key thing where you've got to have a plan. The supply chain risk management family includes a policy and procedure as well. So those types of things are very critical to be aware of. Steve or Melissa, anything you want to add there?
So you really need to think about, the priorities, right? So for some people, this might be not a big lift to move from Rev 4 to Rev 5. Maybe they're already on 6, right? You don't need to change anything, any hardening guidelines there. Maybe you already have your corporate, supply chain risk management developed, and you can just inherit it from them and in a way, right? But then there's still like a lot of intricacies when it comes to these controls and how they have been changed. And it's not an easy and copy paste from your old SSP to the new SSP. You really need to understand the controls. What are their new requirements? A lot of them have new parameters. Some parameters have been removed. You need to understand that. You need to understand what the new guidance is saying. Are you responsible for this new guidance, or is this something that you need to just support as a provider to your customer, right? There are also things such as like you have to be doing red team penetration testing. What does that mean for you? Who is going to do that in your organization? Do you need to hire someone to do it, or is it going to be, you're going to have a third party coming in, or is it going to be internally handled by someone? So all of these things that you need to really think about, and then implementation of these controls. But not only that, updating the documentation that comes with it. It really is a heavy lift. And I know a lot of organizations are like, oh, well, we already have that. We don't need to worry about. But it's a lot. It's going to take a deeper look into one of these controls and requirements and understanding really what they mean.
Perfect. So in the next slide, we talk a little bit just to sort of recap about these changes. You've heard us say supply chain risk management at least a dozen times now. And again, that took us from 17 to 18 families, but we're not ignoring the privacy controls in the PT family, which is personally identifiable information, processing, and transparency. And that's at the agency's discretion. That is, if you are now required to include it and you have PII or PHI or you're processing that, then yes, that comes into scope. And that's going to drive you to 19 families, right? So as far as FedRAMP goes, yes, 18 with the potential for PT. Additionally, the policy and procedure requirements that we already kind of touched on, understanding that you've got varying levels, so organizational, the mission or business level, all the way down to system level. So the parameters, again, pay close attention to those, because the existing controls, while they're still there, and it may be like, oh, I don't have to touch those, the parameters did change for many of these, right? So we outlined earlier on that we had roughly 134 parameter changes. So that's no small effort. Lastly, just kind of touching on OSCAL, which again, I know Steve will dig into, you know, there have been multiple agencies as part of the 10X project who have been working with OSCAL-based SSPs, and it's already out on the street that roughly 1 year from now, or by the end of December 2024, packages will need to be submitted in an OSCAL format. So that's something else that folks need to consider, and also a key component to Xacta 360, right? So if you want to move to the next slide, we're going to talk just a little bit about the level of effort and remediation for a number of categories. We've got this broken down into where you've kind of got a documentation only implementation, maybe you got documentation plus configuration, and then the fact that you're going to have to add a new process, right? So at the moderate baseline, we're really describing this at a high level and not digging into every single control and every single parameter. But from a low level of effort, right, for new controls, parameter changes, and overall Rev 4 to Rev 5 changes, right? As you can see there, we've got 3 assigned to documentation. You got 3 new controls that ultimately have a low level of effort. And while I'm not going to kind of necessarily go through each one, in the following slides, we kind of break out what this picture really looks like for those, 134 items that we're describing. So if you want to move to the moderate level, we'll kind of dig into that a little bit. Here, what we've done is we've broken this down into, at the moderate level of effort, the minimal kind of expectations around the gap between a moderate Rev 4 and a moderate Rev 5, and then where there is substantial effort that's going to have to be executed. So, from a new controls perspective, yes, there's a couple that just need documentation, but then you have, one that's going to require new processes as well as documentation. So getting down to the substantial types of efforts where you've got policy and procedure updates, full Rev 4 to Rev 5 changes. These types of situations, understanding those parameters, again, is where we kind of shine in assisting and helping folks understand what that means and how to go about executing this. The high level, which is on our next slide, there really aren't too many there, except to say you've got one key parameter change that has an impact, along with a handful of those that will require new configurations, modifications to parameters, and then, oh, by the way, we've got a significant change from a Rev 4 to Rev 5. So this breakout is based on the FedRAMP workbook, which is provided by the GSA. So for any of you that may not be familiar, up on the GSA website, they've done a great job of taking the security control baselines, comparing Rev 4 to Rev 5, and showing you where you can expect some of these controls to be impacted, in addition to the NIST special pubs assigned to those controls. So I encourage folks to go check that out. Steve, I don't know if there's anything you guys wanted to add there.
No, I think you covered it really great. I mean, I think your by the numbers chart really gives everybody an understanding of different expectations, right, for what they're going to be dealing with as they go. Not just if you're not just transitioning, right, from 4 to 5, because that's one specific case. But this is just be aware that these are heavy lifts that are different from the way people have been previously doing it. So it's going to cause a little bit of, again, negotiation, discussion with the PMO. Right, they're not quite sure how to handle some of these yet either, right? And how they're going to come across and how the documentation is going to look. So I think you bring up a great by the numbers approach that everybody should get a little bit, more perspective on how dramatic the change is going to be.
Yeah, and even more importantly, there wasn't a single family unimpacted, right? Every family was impacted in some way. And okay, the supply chain risk management family's new. We'll put that one to the side. But when you look at these others, right, you've got to break down per family of the low, moderate, and high level of effort expectations for each of these families. So again, it is something that requires a gap assessment per company and per system to understand, okay, which one of these components, right, across your system security plan, documentation, architecture, and design come into play. But in a by the numbers approach and by the workbook approach, this is what that breakout looks like. So this is what you can expect. And with that, let's talk about one of the biggest ones, which is encryption. So, June of last year, I think it was June 5th, if I'm not mistaken, we moved into a state of 140-3 where all the FIPS 140-2 modules that were either historically retired or not in process for 140-3 were determined to be no longer authorized for use. So this expectation, is something that was years in the making, and anybody who's dealt with the PMO will tell you, well, you had 5 years to prepare for it. Okay, we did, but there are thousands upon thousands of vendors out there who are working towards it, and we have this thing called a vendor dependency. So when it comes to, encryption, whether storing, processing, transmitting data at rest, in motion, backups, whatever, all encryption has to be accounted for and documented in a new table that is similar to the one you see on the screen. And what's interesting is we spent almost 7 months figuring out what this needed to look like with the PMO. And when I say we, I mean the community, right? So each encryption component has to be addressed and identified with its purpose, with the vendor, including its cryptographic module validation program number. In other words, that certificate number. And then, what is it being used for? How's it being used? And what is the name of that product, tool, or technology? Well, this is something that under Rev 4 we were submitting as an additional artifact, and it was, secondary to the SSP, where now this is an expectation, right? Where this has to be included, all encryption captured in this way. So it's important for those Rev 4 folks who haven't been exposed to this or haven't done this yet. You need to know what your encryption is. You need to have a plan and understand your 140-2 to 140-3 gap. Make sure nothing's been sunset or historically retired. Check those operating systems and other components to make sure you're not going to fall into a critical situation. So here, again, just kind of wrapping up, keep in mind that encryption is being more heavily tracked in addition to understanding impacts against quantum encryption. So I'll stop there, see if Steve or Melissa has anything they want to add.
I think Melissa wants to add something, but I'll just say,
okay.
I know, I can see her. I think everybody would want to jump up and down at this one, to be honest, right? It's definitely worthy of its own slide. And I think, just for most work, again, if you haven't been through this process before, if you don't really know what's going on as far as encryption and FedRAMP, this is a huge, huge deal. This in and of itself, it causes a huge amount of delays for organizations as they go forward with the FedRAMP process. If you're not already FedRAMP 140-2 compliant today as you're starting, right? If you're getting prioritized, if you're not already at least at that point, it's a non-starter. You basically you might as well table it and wait till you can get your development team, using the certified cryptographic modules to move forward. I don't think I can jump up and down and foot stomp that enough. So, but I'll let Melissa also add something.
Okay, so I have 2 points, right? One, we come across this a lot. Our customers think that just because they're using AWS encryption, that's it, they're good. And we always get that answer. But like, what happens with your application? Who's developing the application? Right? What's there? Like, what modules are you using for that encryption? That is your source code. AWS is not developing that for you. So what are you using there? Another point is that just not recently, if you see in the Rev 5 guidance for SC 8.1 for the database encryption, you can't just encrypt the database itself, right? Just a full database. If you have multiple customers there, you have to have individual customer keys. And that's going to be a big one for a lot of people. So you have to have, I mean, customer specific keys. Some organizations may use, database per customer, so you don't really have to worry about that much as long as it's a FIPS encryption, right? But if you're sharing the database as a multi-tenant, then you really have to restructure that and find a better way. And I don't know if anyone else has to add anything to that. I think it's a big one.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, every single cloud service provider is dealing with this, right? So you're not alone. So that's part one. Part two is the PMO gets it, right? What they're asking for in a similar fashion to the Rev 4 to Rev 5 is to say, show us that you have a plan. Show us that you know what you need to do and you're working towards it, but don't just let it linger and sit out there and just wait until you actually get into trouble. So again, this is making them aware. For many folks, there are only a handful of folks that actually completed 140-3 prior to June of last year. So many have caught up since then, but the majority are still 140-2. So you're not dead in the water, right? As long as it has not been historically retired or sunset or that crypto isn't expired, you can still use it. But you've got to have a plan and you've got to show what that vendor dependency is in coordination with that plan.
Yeah, I just want to add to that one. I feel like if you already have FedRAMP authorization, you should have a plan, and that's great. Yes, that's it. But if you're just starting off, the plan is not going to help you, or that is literally a showstopper.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The clearance, yeah.
All right. And with that, I will hand it off to Steve.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think we've really done, maybe not a really super deep dive, but we did a great overview of all the different, the various and different changes. I kind of wanted to bring it back again from a product perspective, right? Because we've been doing, some version of what is kind of now considered FedRAMP for over 20 years and building products to kind of streamline and hopefully take the cost down considerably for folks going through this kind of process. It's really important to understand why. So FedRAMP, I hear most of the time from customers that are buying our product to go through the process. I was told that we need FedRAMP. Our sales team tells me we need FedRAMP, so on and so forth. And the first thing I'd say is keep in mind that FedRAMP is, a validation of your security posture, right? It's not just about the technical controls, but also about who has what job responsibilities, how have you kind of, doled out those policies and processes within your organization and committed to, following them and being able to evidence them for the government, right? What they're trying to do is ascertain whether or not you are doing the due diligence associated with cybersecurity to protect the government's information. And they're doing that in a very, specific kind of way on these controls based on how your data is categorized at the high, moderate, or low level. And then, we also have the concept of overlays or the privacy family, right, that might come in. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. Why are we going through this process? It's not really a hunting license so you can run around trying to sell your product to the rest of the federal government, which is good. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's not, but as Telos has just recently been prioritized by the JAB, and we're going through a FedRAMP High right now for our Xacta platform. And I can tell you that one of the things that I think we kind of got through fairly quickly was that crypto element, because we had a long-standing history of working with customers on their own implementations and dealing with folks like Melitza and Martin to really hit home to customers. This is going to be a much longer pole in tent than you think it is. This is about going back and everything inside of your entire ecosystem and application that you're working with, you have to validate the crypto is FIPS 142 at least, and then place it on this plan and path to get to 3. And you run into things that you don't even think about, like, your system does a backup of a certain type of data, and you didn't realize that that backup is encrypted. It's not encrypted with the right library that is, certified for FIPS 140-2 at a minimum. So it's those kind of things that I think is really important. I think the other piece is those procedural elements are actually really critical. When you get your authorization, and Martin and Melissa can kind of talk to this really heavily also. The procedural pieces are actually sometimes the hardest pieces, aside from the crypto, which again, it just takes a lot of really due diligence from a coding perspective and know-how. But procedurally, it's, you have to be able to show that you're doing things in different periodicities, that you're submitting things in the proper formats and by different periodicities, and that you're staying on top of vulnerabilities, assets, customer data, so on and so forth with a regular basis, and be able to, again, evidence that to the PMO so they feel comfortable and trusting you with the government's data, right? And a lot of these, even though people will promise, the world as far as products are concerned, a lot of these are not solved, by technology alone, right? They're actually mostly sometimes solved with understanding the policies, putting the right checks and balances in place. Sometimes you'll leverage technology, but sometimes it's just about, having the right individual with the right role, doing the right job at the right time, And then I think the last piece for the slide is just the continuous monitoring element. So you go through this whole process, you get selected, you go through the FedRAMP authorization at a given baseline, and everybody kind of thinks that their authorization is the end. They're all like, oh, we got our authorization. Yay, right? We're authorized. We can start selling to the customers. That's literally the start. That's the beginning for you, right? Because now it's real. And the government wants to make sure on an ongoing basis, you're continually validating those controls. You're continually submitting your POAM, you're updating your POAMs, and you're working off any liens that they've, given you a certain amount of time to get done. And you're actively working on some of that threat modeling that Martin talked about. And you're actively working on vulnerabilities and patching those and working with your own developers and updating your assets, and software. And this is where having a tool like Xacta, right, becomes really critical, because how do you keep track of all of that, and when you're supposed to be doing what, and how do you get that data back to the PMO in a timely manner in the right format? And so if we can go to the next slide. We can talk a little bit about parameterization and encryption. We kind of foot stomped encryption, so I don't think we have to hit that too much. I wanted to make sure we really brought it back one more time. But I think it was also important to note parameterization, right? So parameterization is basically those organizationally defined values inside of the entire process. And they're dictated, they used to be kind of like dictated by control, but they're actually now kind of dictated by baseline. So you may run into a different parameter based on moderate than you would run into based on high, right? And this can be a little confusing, right? Because the same control. Really having a good understanding of that's important. Because if you're going to low, moderate, or high, it kind of dictates how often you might have to conduct different types of tasks, how many resources you might have to put toward that kind of task, and then how often you're going to have to be in communication with the PMO about different things, right? So this is really a change that is relevant to make sure we're foot stomping. And again, I can't say more than anything, if you're not FIPS 140-2 now and ready to roll, don't try and get into the process until you at least get that really well buttoned up everywhere inside of your ecosystem. You're just gonna, it's an immediate non-starter. And then for most people, if they don't know, you're paying for that test instance that you're going to continually be running, through the procedural elements to evidence things like assessments or vulnerabilities, all those pieces. You're going to have to continually do that so that you can evidence to the PMO when they're ready to accept your documentation that you've been doing it for the past, I can't believe it's like 3 months or something like that. So you're just kind of burning money if you're not kind of ready to get through there at the beginning. Anything, Martin or Melissa, you want to add for those?
I think I'm good.
Yeah. So the last one I think Martin's brought up a few times, and Melissa and I have been living in for quite a while also, and that's OSCAL. So Telos has been, I think everybody agrees with it, but we've really been on the forefront of helping push the envelope as far as OSCAL is concerned. And OSCAL is the Open Security Controls Assessment Language. What this is a machine readable representation of all the data associated with your assessment process, the assessment authorization process. And it's typically in YAML, JSON, XML formats. The idea behind this is that it gives the FedRAMP PMO a standard way to incorporate all this data into a system that allows them to look at it all and really help streamline the authorization and review elements of the process. Now, for most that haven't been through this process before, we'll just have a fun Q&A with Melitza and Martin. How long does it typically take the PMO to get back to folks after they've submitted? And this is not a dig at the PMO at all. It's a lot of information, but just how long do you guys think on average?
This year?
Yeah.
I would definitely say, I know there's a little fallout from the FedRAMP Authorization Act, and that they're funded. They had a lot of changes to processes and hiring and training and all those things. But I would say anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks up to a couple months.
Right.
It's an extent. This year we've experienced very, very long response times in compared to years past, but even then 2 to 4 weeks on average.
Yeah. So I think that's, and you want to add, Melitza?
No, that's
yeah. And that's you're spending money every minute that your system is up and running in this cloud, trying to get evaluated. You can't generate revenue, at least not from a government perspective, because you're not authorized, right? So again, you're kind of in this position where it's not the PMO's fault, but anything we can do to streamline the process, to shorten the window from when you start the process and you submit your package, and then also in the review process and the authorization process, we feel like it's a great thing. It's a whole point of what we built Xacta. So OSCAL is exactly that, right? The idea that you can take all this information, instead of handing the PMO a truckload of data in paper format that somebody's got to push through, read through or search through, and they've got a system that reads it in and it parses it and puts it all in the right places for them to pay attention to, the different parameters, the different controls in the right places, the different elements of backups, and who has access to what, so on and so forth, right? So, and OSCAL is very structured. What's interesting is that we did something very similar with our product a few years ago and called it XDE, right? Xacta Data Exchange. And that was so that we could patch data more simply between customers, CSP, and so on and so forth. So for us, we've always been pushing for the OSCAL piece because it's a natural evolution of what we've already been doing for many years inside of the product. There's a couple of things that I think OSCAL is still going to evolve into. One of them I just put on the bottom here is, it currently does the SSP, the SAP-SAR, the POEM, and the component definition models, which is cool from an inheritance and recommended implementation perspective. But also that prototype mapping module will be really interesting because there's a lot of interest, not just in the standard, but leveraging a FedRAMP authorization for other international standards. And so you have, with this prototype mapping model, the ability to kind of go cross-regulation. So if you're doing IRAP, for instance, or one of the other international standards, they'll be able to help take the current set of data and use it against other standards or evaluations. And that's where you start to really get to, cost reduction. If you've already gone through the pain and the cost of going through a process like this, why have to do it again for another international standard? Why not be able to take and leverage this, map to the appropriate new set of regulations and controls, and go ahead and go forward and be successful, right? Maybe applying small deltas. So OSCAL is huge. The PMO is all in, GSA is all in, Telos is all in. I believe Martin and Melitza are also all in. We've all been paying very close attention to it for the last few years. We all participate in the workshops and working groups. I think part of the PMO OSCAL team loves us. Again, there's a little bit of a love-hate because we're the ones giving them all the lessons learned from how we've done it, but we're also the ones opening tickets like, hey, this is going to need to change to this, so this will work right, but they're a wonderful team to work with. We've got a long-standing history and tradition with them. But yeah, OSCAL really will, in the course of the next year, start really streamlining the review and approval of these packages. So I think that might be one of our I think there's one more slide after this, unless somebody wants to add something.
I was just going to add one thing for people to think about OSCAL as a foundation for something bigger, for something that's coming, right? It is a foundation for using AI down the road. In order to use it smartly, like you really have to set it up in an intelligent way. and have identify each one of the components of your system with the unique identifier. So then you can look for these things specifically. And so the assessments won't take like 3 months. They might take like 15 days. Let's hope. But it's definitely something that that's what the FedRAMP PMO and the GSA is investing in, and other agencies are on this, because that's going to be the backbone of what's to come down the road, right? And I want people to really think about it, how it's maybe at the beginning, and we worked with a lot of customers who are, implementing OSCAL. So it's at the beginning might take a little bit more time to set it up properly, but once you do, it cuts the redundancy, so like by 50%, I would say, and then ties everything in, so everything is connected, and you will know exactly where the gaps are. It's kind of hard to explain right now unless you like really take a deep look in it. But I think it's a great tool to be used.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we fully support OSCAL. You can submit from Xacta your SSP and your SARS, POAM, all that in OSCAL right now. And we were actually credited with being the first first tool that submitted a compliant OSCAL package, I believe on behalf of AWS's package was built using Xacta and submitted their first submission to the PMO and OSCAL. So again, fully behind it. So I think this was the last one, and it's a handful of different pieces, but one of the things I think that really hits home is if you think in terms of imagine for a second as a little metaphor, you live in a mostly wooded area, right? And it's around this time period, and you've got a landscaper that's going to come help you with cleaning up your house and your yard for the fall. Well, you can just basically, if you've got plenty of money and you don't care and you just want to let them do it, you basically go, hey, just go ahead and take care of blow all the leaves, clean all the stuff off the roof, do all the hedge trimming, put all my stuff away, put all my winter stuff put all my summer stuff into the shed, whatever. And some folks like doing that, right? What the three of us have done for customers is, Melitza will come in and give you a really good understanding of how to peel back all the overgrowth and make sure from a consulting perspective, you're ready. And then Martin can come in and say, I'm going to make sure all the leaves are blown. And we're going to make sure that everybody takes a little bit off so that when the 3PAO comes in to do the final evaluation of your system, and Xacta would be all the tools and the hedge trimmers and all the pieces that everybody used, right, to get through there. But once you get there, they show up and your costs are considerably lower, right? You already kind of know what you were doing and how to get through it. And maybe you've taken off a huge chunk of cost because, you did it through self-assessment. You've engaged an advisor before you went through the 3PAO process. You've already got a good idea of what your gaps are, and maybe you've been leveraging infrastructure that you've been helped along with from a place like StackArmor, right? And you're documenting it all in one repository like Xacta to really streamline the process, submit it through OSCAL, and get you all the way home, rather than showing up for the 3PAO and having them say, wow, we're going to have to write all your documentation for you. It's kind of going to cost you a fortune and take forever. So hopefully that kind of hits home for everybody.
Okay, and I think we are ready for some questions. Let's see. Oops. Okay, so there's a question for if you are moving from Rev 4 to Rev 5 and you need to update your system to meet the statistics, wouldn't that be considered a significant change? Anyone wants to take that? Would that be considered a significant change if you're moving from statistics from CI's benchmark to statistics?
I think most of this is going to be considered as all of this is considered, I think, in the eyes of the PMO, significant change, which is why they're trying to get the language and everything out to everybody to understand how much of a transition strategy you kind of really need to have. I think just that element in and of itself is one piece of a much larger puzzle. You kind of have to talk about it in the context of this transition from a controls perspective, a parameters perspective. The baselines have changed. There's new things. It's not as simple to say that just moving from CIS benchmarks to DISA-STIGs is a it's one element of a much larger set of changes that obviously would be considered a significant change.
I'll touch on that too for a second, because I think I get the spirit of the question, because of what's being done. So, you know, at the heart and soul of every SCR is a impact analysis, right? You know, what is the impact of those STIGs and these changes? What are we going to break? How's that going to work? But when you think about the purpose and existence of a significant change for things like new services, new features, changing operating systems, databases, or even architecture, adding an API gateway where one didn't exist before. When we're talking about the kinds of things that are quote unquote sort of mandated by the baseline, in other words, things that you have to do, I don't see it as a significant change. I see it as meeting the requirements, but I would also say it's something that's going to get tested during the next annual assessment. And additionally, unlike a significant change, you're not going to be asking the agency for permission, right? Permission is not the right way to word that, but it's not a situation where you're going to have to take the STIGs before the PMO and before the JAB and before an agency and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's something you have to do. So in that aspect, I don't know that I could see it as a significant change, but I understand the spirit of the question, because it's a significant effort.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I think, you know, as Martin said, it might not be a significant change, but also talk to your AO, as you mentioned. Like, so it's always a conversation that's back and forth to really understand what they're accepting, what they are willing to accept, and what they would consider a significant change for you. And if you have any deviations, you have to document them, and that would follow the same process that has already been, right? Okay, so on to the next question. All right, you mentioned a requirement for the red team exercise. Do you have any suggestions or guidance on how to implement this control?
Yep. Who wants to go first?
You can go.
Yeah, sure, we'll jump in. So that's kind of a big one. And it's one that a lot of CSPs are kind of proactive in this, and where they'll go through the process of having, you know, multiple penetration testers or red teaming type exercises just to get a variety and well-rounded approach to things. You have a 3PAO who's going to come in once a year and do these types of activities. In other words, they're going to attack the environment, whether through social engineering, phishing campaigns, vishing campaigns, along with penetration tests. Great way to leverage them in that capacity. And you can work with them as well if you don't have this ability in-house. There are many organizations who can assist with this type of activity, whereas before you may have been solely relying on the 3PAO. Steve, you want to add anything?
No, I would absolutely add that I can't more wholly endorse taking this responsibility in-house. I think it's first and foremost, it's one of those things from a cybersecurity perspective that most of the folks that want, like most of the professionals that are working in cybersecurity like this type of work, right? It is work that's actually more interesting and fun than a lot of the documentation process. And much like I think people, you know, I was saying what I said earlier about you can pay somebody to do all this for you. I'm a huge fan of not kind of going that way. I think building the institutional knowledge inside of your organization is tremendously valuable, right? So there are obvious requirements for separate roles and responsibilities just to get through the procedural elements of the risk management process that is FedRAMP, let alone the transition or moving on Rev 5. When you take in the cost associated to keep a team that's going to be able to conduct some of these, so that you can stay ahead of some of the larger potential issues and vulnerabilities that are coming out across the year prior to your 3PAO evaluation, I think it pays really considerable dividends. When you get an idea of how big the breadbox is 6 months before your assessment's coming back up for reauthorization, and you find out, wow, we have a huge problem with Log4j, right? Or some other supply chain problem or something because we've found a piece of this element. I think it really puts you in a position to button up and make things a lot more secure, more simply and more cost effectively than every time you're going to want to go down this process to, you know, go outside of a third-party firm and have a, you know, somewhere between $10,000 to $25,000 red team event done.
I think we are right on time. Do we have, can we do one more question or no?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Okay, all right, so let's just cover this one. So based on the SA 15 control requirements, the development standard tools have to meet FedRAMP authorization requirements. Does that mean the development is now part of the authorization boundary? No. Okay, sorry. Thinking aloud. So what they're really looking there is to ensure that all your tools you bring in, they are supporting your production environment, right? You want to make sure that they're vetted properly, that you do supply and risk, management on them to make sure that once you use them, right, like before you use them, you do your due diligence to ensure that there are, the tools that you are that are going to support your production environment in like indirect way. So you have to do the risk assessment on each one of those and make sure that they fall under that supply chain risk management control. Martin or Steve want to add in?
Martin probably will have a great last word here, just based on the Stack Armor and their background. I would just add that I think there's a little bit of an it depends there, because if you're doing like real DevOps, DevSecOps inside of your development, and part of your development pipeline is actually within your boundary, I mean, then all bets are on, right? So I mean, I think then you really have to be careful, because almost every tool that you're leveraging is going to be in some way, shape, or form considered sometimes in scope. And I say sometimes because if it's the IDE that your developers are using, you might get away with not having to call it a part of your scope. But there's other elements to that you really have to be cautious of. So scoping your system, what's a part of your FedRAMP authorization boundary is really important. Again, sometimes that's a negotiation. Sometimes it's very clear cut, right? If you're going to, for instance, use Salesforce is kind of your help desk and ticketing solution, you're going to have to go with the one that's already authorized, at least at the level you're seeking to authorize, right? Because then that system is definitely considered, essentially sharing data in scope. So I think that sometimes it's a little more circumstantial based on the scope of your authorization, and I would leave it to a Milica, or a 3PAO advisor, or maybe even some folks on Martin's team. From the tool perspective, we can support all of the scope, but I think you really would want some advisory there to make some judgments.
Yeah, the only couple things I would add to that is that, ironically, it's been a year. October 17th of last year is when the period of comments for public comments on the authorization boundary guidance, which the reason that's significant is because the boundary guidance that's proposed does ask you to include development as a part of that. So staging, test and dev, pre-prod, in a way that the PMO can see that you're doing something, you're not just pushing to production. And what we've seen over the last year is them asking to at least include it on the diagram, but not necessarily in the boundary, right? So the other thing I'll tie into that, just to kind of wrap up, is that threat modeling, okay, is a core component to it. So those SA 15 controls, as it relates back to threat modeling, is inclusive of not just vulnerabilities, but supply chain as well. And also the static dynamic code analysis and the development of the application. And I'll stop there because I know we're a little over.
Okay. All right. I think that's it. That brings us to the end of for any questions that we have not answered, we'll follow up with you.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick just for some closing remarks. Okay, I would like to thank our participants as well as Martin, Stephen, and Melissa for being with us today. We hope the information you received during this webinar has been helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, everyone will receive a recording of the presentation in a follow-up email. If you have any questions or would like to request more information, feel free to contact the Telos team at Carahsoft. Our contact information is displayed on your screen, so please don't hesitate to call or email us. If you'd like to provide feedback on today's webinar, a few survey questions will be on your screen momentarily, so please stay on. Thank you and have a great day.